We have learned that a soldier based in North Carolina was killed during Iranian attacks over the weekend. U.S. leaders say 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan died Saturday. This is as the U.S. continues its war with Iran. Now, he was killed after an Iranian strike on a U.S. base in Jordan. He was originally from Hawaii but was based at Fort Bragg. Several other troops were hurt in that attack. And 19-year-old Army Private Isabella Gonzalez also died in Iranian attacks over the weekend. She was from Texas but was stationed in Germany before fighting started in the Middle East. Another service member died in Iraq after a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone. U.S. officials say another soldier is missing in action. The deaths mark the first American troop death since the tentative peace deal with Iran was reached.